In the glittering world of fashion, where perfection is often measured by symmetry, flawlessness, and fleeting youth, one woman dared to shatter every expectation. Kristen McMenamy, born in Pennsylvania, rose to prominence in the 1990s not by conforming to beauty standards, but by rejecting them entirely. She was not the classical beauty that magazines once celebrated. She was angular, severe, and in many ways unsettling to look at. And yet she became one of the most iconic faces of her era. Her defining moment came in 1992 when she shaved off her eyebrows. What should have been a career-ending decision turned into a revolution. Suddenly, her alien-like presence was everywhere, on the covers of Vogue, walking for Chanel, haunting the runways of Jean-Paul Gaultier and Alexander McQueen. She embodied a new kind of beauty, mysterious, raw, and unapologetically strange. To some, she was the queen of grunge and the heroine of heroin chic. To others, she was a disturbing reminder of how far fashion was willing to go in the name of shock. But Kristen McMenamy was more than just an image. Behind the haunting eyes and fearless persona was a woman who faced rejection, ridicule, and heartbreak. She endured whispers that called her ugly pretty. She lived through the collapse of a marriage to renowned photographer Miles Aldridge. And even as she aged, she refused to retreat, walking runways well into her 50s and 60s, defying an industry that worships youth. Her story is not one of perfection, but of resilience, rebellion, and mystery. Kristen McMenamy is a living paradox, fragile yet unbreakable, silent yet powerful, flawed yet unforgettable. But was she a trailblazer who liberated fashion, or a symbol of its darkest obsessions? That is the question her life continues to pose. Kristen McMenamy was born in 1964 in Easton, Pennsylvania, far from the glamour of Paris or Milan. Growing up, she did not fit the mold of a traditional beauty. Her sharp features, angular jawline, and unusually tall, lanky frame set her apart from the all-American girl look that dominated fashion magazines in the 1980s. For Kristen, this difference was both a burden and a gift, though she would not understand the latter until much later. When she first attempted to enter modeling, the industry didn't know what to do with her. Agencies and casting directors turned her away, dismissing her as awkward or simply not pretty enough. The cruel nickname "ugly pretty" followed her in the early years of her career, a term that cut deep but also hinted at the strange magnetism she carried. At a time when Cindy Crawford's curves and Christy Turlington's classic elegance reigned supreme, McMenamy's stark and unconventional looks seemed almost alien. Kristen herself admitted to struggling with self-esteem during this period. She was desperate to belong in a world that told her she didn't fit. Yet beneath the insecurities, she had an instinct, a quiet understanding that beauty was not always about perfection. It was about impact, about presence, about making people remember you. And in that sense, her flaws were not weaknesses, but weapons waiting to be unleashed. Her resilience began to shine when she landed her first small jobs, slowly gaining traction in Europe, where fashion was more experimental. European designers saw what Americans had missed, that Kristen's severe look carried drama, mystery, and an unsettling beauty that could stop you in your tracks. Still, the rejection and ridicule left scars. Kristen's early years were defined by a constant struggle, not just to prove herself to the fashion world, but to believe in her own worth. She was a misfit in an industry obsessed with perfection, but deep down, she knew that if she could endure, she might one day redefine what beauty itself could mean. By the early 1990s, Kristen McMenamy had already carved out a fragile space for herself in the fashion industry. She was booking some jobs, appearing in editorials, and working steadily in Europe, but she had not yet crossed into the realm of superstardom. She was still the odd one out, the girl with the too sharp features and the too strange look. And in a world where supermodels were becoming household names, Kristen hovered on the edges, unforgettable but not yet iconic. Everything changed in 1992. In what seemed at first like a reckless, almost self-destructive move, Kristen shaved off her eyebrows completely. It was not an accident, nor a moment of madness, but a deliberate act of reinvention. She later explained that she was tired of trying to be what people wanted her to be. If she was going to be remembered, it would not be for blending in. It would be for standing out. The effect was immediate and electric. With her newly bare face, Kristen no longer looked like anyone else in the modeling world. Her bone structure, already sharp, became even more pronounced. Her eyes, now framed by the eerie absence of brows, seemed to pierce through the camera. Overnight, she transformed from a struggling model into a living piece of avant-garde art. Designers and photographers could not get enough. Karl Lagerfeld cast her for Chanel. Jean-Paul Gaultier adored her and used her in some of his most theatrical shows. But perhaps most famously, she became a muse for Alexander McQueen, whose dark, provocative vision found its perfect match in Kristen's haunting beauty. She no longer walked runways, she haunted them. Every step she took seemed to challenge the audience. What is beauty? What is ugly? And do you really know the difference? The media, of course, was divided. Some praised her as a genius who had rewritten the rules of fashion. Others mocked her, calling her ghastly or alien. But Kristen was unbothered. She had found her power in provocation. Ugly pretty, the insult that once hurt her, became her brand. She embodied grunge, the heroin chic aesthetic, and the rejection of polished perfection. This transformation did more than change her career. It redefined an era. The early 1990s were about rebellion, about tearing down glossy illusions and replacing them with rawness and edge. Kristen McMenamy stood at the center of that cultural shift, proving that sometimes the most radical way to be beautiful is to embrace what others call flawed. It was in that moment, without eyebrows, without apology, that Kristen McMenamy stopped being just a model and became an icon. By the mid-1990s, Kristen McMenamy was no longer the outsider struggling to be noticed. She was everywhere. The transformation that had once seemed unthinkable, a model with no eyebrows, a face that looked carved in marble, severe and almost ghostly, had catapulted her into the ranks of the most sought-after names in fashion. Her image was splashed across the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, ID, and countless other magazines that once might have dismissed her. Now they celebrated her as the very definition of high fashion's new edge. Kristen had become the queen of grunge. While America's fashion media glorified glossy icons like Cindy Crawford or Claudia Schiffer, Kristen embodied something raw, stranger, and infinitely more modern. She wore thrift store layers on the runway, walked with a detached, almost haunted expression, and carried herself like a woman who belonged to another dimension. She wasn't selling perfection, she was selling defiance. This was also the era of the so-called heroin chic look: pale skin, hollow cheeks, dark circles under the eyes. It was an aesthetic that fascinated some and horrified others. And Kristen McMenamy became one of its most recognizable faces. Designers and photographers praised her for embodying the zeitgeist, but critics accused fashion of glamorizing sickness and despair. Kristen herself was caught in the storm. Was she an artist expressing something profound about beauty, or was she complicit in an industry feeding off destruction? The debate only added to her mystique. Her collaborations with Alexander McQueen in particular became legendary. McQueen, known for his gothic and often disturbing runway shows, found in Kristen the perfect muse. Draped in his sculptural gowns or clothed in shredded fabrics, she looked less like a model and more like a specter, an otherworldly figure channeling the darkness and brilliance of his vision. Every appearance she made seemed to blur the line between fashion and performance art. Yet for all the acclaim, there was no shortage of controversy. Critics and cultural commentators accused her of helping define an era of models who looked unhealthy and too thin, feeding into dangerous beauty ideals. Parents groups lashed out at magazines that put Kristen's unsettling image on the cover. But in the world of high fashion, the backlash only made her more powerful. She was untouchable, a woman who represented the edge of beauty itself. Kristen McMenamy was no longer a model trying to prove her worth. She had become a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of rebellion against everything fashion was supposed to be. And yet, beneath the glamour and controversy, her story was far from over. Because what happens when the industry that celebrates you for being different eventually turns its gaze to the next face, the next shock, the next rebellion?
While Kristen McMenamy commanded the runway with haunting confidence, her personal life told a different story, one filled with silence, fragility, and private struggles that rarely made headlines. Unlike some of her contemporaries who eagerly embraced celebrity culture, Kristen guarded her world off the runway with an almost impenetrable shield. She was, in many ways, a mystery, not just to the public, but even to those who worked closely with her. In 1997, Kristen married renowned British fashion photographer Miles Aldridge, a man known for his hyper-stylized, surreal images dripping in saturated color. Together, they seemed like a match born out of the fashion world's creative fire, the muse and the image maker, the strange beauty and the artist who knew how to frame it. Their marriage produced 3 children, and for a time, Kristen seemed to retreat slightly from the public gaze, focusing on family life. But behind the surface, the relationship carried fractures. Aldridge's career was demanding, Kristen was still pulled back into fashion at intervals, and the quiet intensity that defined her public persona seemed to shadow her private world. When the couple eventually divorced, it was not a loud, tabloid-fueled split filled with scandals and public statements. Instead, it was quiet, almost ghostly, much like Kristen herself. Yet the press still painted it as a fall from grace, speculating that the enigmatic muse had been abandoned or left behind by the vibrant art world she once helped inspire. This period of her life revealed a different kind of struggle. Kristen had built her career by embracing strangeness, but in her personal world, she sought something simple: stability, love, and belonging. The end of her marriage forced her into another reinvention. Though this one was not about aesthetics or the runway, it was about finding her strength as a woman, not just as a model. What makes her story so compelling is that she never offered explanations. Unlike many public figures who defend, confess, or clarify, Kristen remained silent. She rarely gave interviews about her family or her private life. This silence only deepened her mystery. People projected their own narratives onto her: the abandoned wife, the resilient mother, the eternal muse. But the truth remained locked away, known only to her. Even after her divorce, she returned to modeling, walking runways in her 50s and 60s with the same otherworldly aura that had once made her famous. It was as if Kristen had decided that if her personal life was going to unravel, her professional life would remain untouched, proof that she was still unbreakable, still relevant, still capable of haunting the fashion world on her own terms. Behind her silence was resilience. Kristen McMenamy never offered answers to the rumors, never allowed herself to be defined by heartbreak, and that very refusal to explain became yet another layer of her enigma.
On July 8, 2022, at the Valentino Haute Couture show in Rome,
Kristen McMenamy once again became the center of global attention, not for her striking looks, but for a moment that shocked the fashion world. Dressed in a glittering gown and towering heels, she stepped onto the runway like she had countless times before. But within seconds, disaster struck. The shoes betrayed her. She stumbled, then collapsed to the floor. Cameras flashed, the audience gasped, and millions later replayed the moment online as it went viral across the globe. In that instant, Kristen McMenamy's fall became more than just a runway accident. To some, it was a symbol of the cruelty of an industry that forces women, even those in their late 50s, into impossible standards of elegance and youth. Others saw it as a humiliation, a tragic reminder that time spares no one, not even icons. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the moment came after the fall. Kristen stood up, slipped off the treacherous shoes, and continued to walk the runway barefoot, her face a mask of icy determination. She turned a moment of vulnerability into an act of defiance. The media's reaction was divided. Some praised her resilience, calling it a powerful metaphor for survival, a woman rejecting the tools that caused her downfall and reclaiming her power on her own terms. Others were less forgiving, suggesting her fall was evidence that her time had passed, that she should have stepped aside for younger models. The debate grew heated, but in true McMenamy fashion, she offered no explanation, no apology, no grand statement. She simply kept moving forward. Yet the Valentino fall also reopened long-standing questions about aging in fashion. Few models, especially women, are allowed to remain visible past a certain age. The runway is often unforgiving, celebrating youth as the ultimate commodity. But Kristen McMenamy refused to disappear. At nearly 60, she stood on that stage, fragile yet unyielding, proving that age does not erase presence. It was more than a stumble. It was a confrontation with time itself. Kristen's fall embodied the precarious balance between mortality and immortality in fashion. Models are often treated like symbols frozen in youth, yet here was a living legend, reminding the world that beauty does not end with age, even if the body falters. The Valentino incident, far from tarnishing her career, cemented her status as an enduring figure of defiance. Kristen McMenamy had fallen, yes, but she had risen in a way that no camera could ever forget. In her barefoot walk, the world saw not a broken icon, but a survivor who refused to let time or fashion define her end. Kristen McMenamy's story is not one of easy victories or conventional success. It is the story of a woman who turned rejection into identity, who transformed the very idea of beauty by embracing what others called flaws. In a world where supermodels were once celebrated for glossy perfection, Kristen forced fashion to confront something darker, stranger, and far more powerful. The truth that beauty is not universal, but deeply subjective, and sometimes even unsettling. Her legacy lies in this radical redefinition. By shaving her eyebrows in 1992, she opened the door for models who did not fit traditional molds. Designers and photographers who once sought the perfect face began searching for the unusual, the otherworldly, the unforgettable. The fashion landscape became richer, more diverse, and infinitely more interesting because Kristen dared to be different. Today's runway, filled with models of varying sizes, ethnicities, and identities, owes something to the rebellion she sparked decades earlier. But Kristen's impact is not just visual, it is emotional. Her silent resilience, her ability to endure ridicule, heartbreak, and even public stumbles resonates far beyond the runway. She became a symbol of defiance against the cruelty of an industry that consumes youth and discards age. By continuing to walk runways in her 50s and 60s, she reminded the world that relevance is not measured by age, but by presence and spirit. The Valentino fall in 2022 captured this truth in a single moment. It was not just a stumble, it was a metaphor for her life and career. Again and again, she has been told she is not enough, that she doesn't belong, that her time has passed. And again, she has risen, barefoot if she must, and kept walking. That image, fragile yet unbroken, will forever define her legacy. Kristen McMenamy's life invites us to question what we think beauty is. Is it perfection, or is it the courage to be unforgettable in imperfection? She never gave the answer directly, perhaps because she understood that the mystery is more powerful than any explanation. Her silence, her refusal to conform, her haunting presence, these became her greatest statements. In the end, Kristen McMenamy will be remembered not just as a supermodel, but as a disruptor, a survivor, and a muse of contradictions. She is proof that flaws can become power, that falls can become triumphs, and that sometimes the most enduring beauty is the one we cannot fully understand. If you found her story moving, consider subscribing for more Untold Legacies.